Welcome back to the Olmstead workshop. Today we're building a vinyl record storage cabinet, and we're going to start our project by rough cutting some poplar to approximate dimensions for what's going to eventually make up the stand of the cabinet. Here I take my two poplar boards and rip them to length to make the four legs that are then going to be attached with stretchers to support the cabinet base. Here I use the tapering jig to cut my legs to a 2-to-1 taper, about 2.5 inches at the top and 1.5 inches at the bottom. I wanted my legs to have a slight lean, so I cut a 5-degree angle on the top and bottom of each leg in a parallel fashion so the tops would remain flat while leaning inward slightly. Here I'm using the Beadlock Pro system to make some loose tenon joinery. Another great method for attaching the legs to the stretchers would be dowels or a festool domino if you happen to have one. Once my joints were glued up, it was time to attach clamps, clean up the glue, and let them sit. While my base frame was in clamps drying, I began cutting up my piece of 3/4 maple plywood. I was using a Craig AccuCut for the first time. It's a pretty neat system if you only have a circular saw. I could see where a traditional track saw would be really beneficial, but this could also be formed with a long straight edge with some clamps to act as a guide. This system also worked very well to cut my angled cuts, which were just a little too long and unwieldy. I didn't feel safe doing them on the table saw. After cutting all my profiles, I then decided to start cutting my individual shelves to length and my divider pieces. Breaking down sheet goods this way on top of hard-packed insulated foam was my first time doing it on this project, and it was actually very easy, and I look forward to doing it again. I swapped out my Freud blade for a Forest Dado King so I could begin cutting the dados that are going to support my divider shelves. I intentionally set my dado stack more narrow than my stock piece. That way I can cut the dado in 2 passes and really creep up on the accurate measurement. Here I'm ripping a long angle cut on the top of my center divider. I measured out the slope of my side pieces and just matched that. Here I'm marking out and cutting my support shelf so I can have dividers that'll hold individual columns of records and just dry fitting them to place with biscuits. And cutting more biscuits into my front shelves dividers. It's only fitting that my most ambitious project to date would also have my most complicated and stressful glue up to date. Unfortunately, my camera battery died partway through this as I was working well into the night to meet a deadline, but you do get to see my center shelf and dividers come into place. My main load-bearing pieces were supported with dados, and the dividers that are being held into place with biscuits and glue are just dividers to hold records into single columns. So they aren't load bearing, they're just more organizational. Here I've measured down from the top of my leg support to where I would like the stretchers to be to support the case. I'm also matching the top 5-degree angle that I cut for that leg lean and matching it to my mark out line for where the stretchers are going to be, so they will be parallel to the top surface. I then used 2 of the holes on my beadlock system to just drill essentially cross dowel pins into a couple pieces of poplar that I have for my stretchers. These pieces are just rough cut at the time, so they're not going to be exact measurements. I then used a dowel center to mark the location of my first dowel hole and installed a dowel there and put the dowel center in the second hole to line up exactly where I needed both of them in regards to my line to make sure that everything is parallel to the floor. Of course, I had to perform this process a total of 4 times for each side of the 2 stretchers. After that, I ripped these stretchers to just make them blend better with the leg taper and be less noticeable from the front. Once everything was dried, I put the cabinet into the frame and drilled 2 holes from the bottom side to mark out my location where I was going to use threaded inserts. After all, this was a gift for a friend who has a very small vehicle and had to be able to get it home. For the legs, I was going to ebonize them using some Speedball India ink. This stuff is very, very dark and it will get everywhere, so if you try this, I recommend gloves and a drop cloth, as you can see here. This dye is water-based and will raise the grain of your wood, so you want to make sure that you sand to a high finish, wet your wood, sand again before applying the dye. I did apply a couple of coats of the India ink just to make sure that I got a really deep, uniform color all over. The India ink did dry very quickly in my garage due to just ambient temperature, but since it does have problems with wiping finishes, I did go over the whole thing with just a seal coat of polyacrylic spray, and then I came back with wipe on poly to give the legs a nice high gloss finish. After 3 coats of wipe-on poly, I let the stand cure, and with that it was completed and I was ready to move on to the rest of the casework. Moving on to the case itself, I went with a Min Wax Dark Walnut stained. And I was really looking for a kind of rustic looking finish, so I was very quickly and abrasively applying it just to make sure that it really soaked into the cracks and was a little more weathered looking over the large expanses like the front, sides, and back of the case. The dark walnut did a great job covering this piece, and the plywood really just soaked it up. I did end up using a second piece just so I could darken the color a little bit and get the tone I was looking for. Once that was complete, I put my brand onto the bottom and applied a couple coats of wipe-on satin poly finish. That way I got a nice high contrast of gloss legs with the satin casework. Once everything was dried, it was time to put it all together and take a few finished photos. With that, the project was done and was ready for delivery. Thanks again for stopping by the Olmstead workshop, and we hope to see you next time.